So this is the front of our museum. We've decorated it to look like a World War II British bunker. And a couple of things we have outside the museum doors here is we have a World War I mortar. This is a German mortar. It's called a Minenwerfer, which literally translates to mine thrower. And this is a particularly interesting piece of equipment because we've restored it to what it looked like during World War I. And this one was designed both offensively and defensively. You could use it to fire mortars, which are bombs that would go up in the air and fall down on the enemy. You can level it out so that it fires straight in more of an anti-tank role. You can also rotate it around 180 degrees and fire message canisters back to your headquarters. So what they would do, wherever they placed one of these mortars, they would map out the elevation, the angle, the trajectory, the range exactly to a certain point back at headquarters that they'd have fenced off, where the mortar crews could literally turn around and fire a message canister back, which was a hollow round that you would put a note into. And then there was some poor soldier who was supposed to run out there in this field and pick up all these empty canisters as they hit the ground. So he had to dodge the incoming message rounds. But anyway, then he'd walk over and carry him into headquarters. So it was much faster than running all the way back, versus just a quick turn around, fire it off, and then go back. One of the things we have hanging from the ceiling here is a World War I German anti-tank rifle. It's called a T-Gewehr, which stands for T-gun. And I do not think T stands for tank. I don't remember. I have to look it up every time. But the size of round that it fired is 13 millimeters in diameter, which is the size of about, it's like 75 caliber. It's pretty big. It's also a very heavy gun. This was the gun that they said you shouldn't fire more than 3 times in quick succession because it gives you concussion. So yeah, you don't want to shoot that one very much. You guys ready to go inside? Alright, here we go.
Alright guys, you ready to answer?
Alright, come on in. So one of the first things that I'm going to show you guys is on the floor right here. It's this big gray thing. What was one of the weapons that navies would use to fight against submarines? Do you guys know?
Depth charges?
Yeah, do you think this might be one?
I'm guessing.
It used to be. This one was actually dated April of 1945 when it was built. There is a date stamp on it. But somebody converted it to be a potbelly stove. Okay. So this is what they look like on the outside. That entire inside would be packed full of explosives. And then on the back there would be a little gauge. So when the captain said set the depth charges for 200 feet, then before they'd all go off the ship, they were held in big racks and they'd just roll off. One sailor would go out there and he'd turn the dials all to 200 feet, and then they'd pull the lever out and they'd all roll off the ship and they'd all start going down. And then once they got down to a certain depth, whatever it happened to be, then they'd explode. And they didn't actually have to hit the submarine. They just had to be close enough to cause a shock wave in the water to cause enough damage to the submarine to let water leak in. Because you don't want water in a boat, right? That's just telephone order. You guys probably haven't seen a telephone on the table before, have you? No. That one, you actually have wires on that one. Anyway, behind us in this square glass display case, we have 2 artifacts from the first United States counterattack after Pearl Harbor, which was when? Does anybody know? All right, let's make it easier. Let's go for the date.
7th, 1942.
Well, that was Pearl Harbor, yeah. What was the first counterattack against Japan in World War II?
Was it
Doolittle's Raid?
Doolittle Raid, there you go. How many of you guys talked to the class this morning and know what I'm going to talk about?
No.
Oh, good, good. The scarf you see in the smaller box, that was worn by Colonel Doolittle on the raid. During the Doolittle raid, they flew B-25 bombers off the deck of the USS Hornet aircraft carrier, which is something that had never been done in combat before. And after the Doolittle raid successfully dropped bombs on Tokyo and a couple other Japanese cities, the planes made their way towards China and Russia to friendly airfields, none of which actually made it to their designated landing area. And then most of them crashed because they ran out of fuel. And from there, do you know where all the pilots and the air crews went after they crash landed their planes? They didn't have a plane anymore, and they're in sort of friendly territory.
We didn't cover the ones that made it into the friendly territory.
Okay. They walked, and they walked to New Delhi, India. It took them like 6 months. The larger item in there is a piece of the parachute from Colonel Doolittle's co-pilot that he carried with him all the way to New Delhi, and we got a piece of it now. Go ahead.
Was it part of their plan to walk to New Delhi? Did they know that they were going to crash because they were going to run out of fuel?
No, what happened was there was a Japanese destroyer or picket ship that found the task force. It was like 400 or 1,000 miles. I don't remember the exact distance, but it was a fairly significant distance away from Japan earlier than the normal launch point was supposed to be. So the U.S. task force sunk that ship, but they didn't know if that ship had gotten a radio message back to Japan or not, which in fact it had not. But they didn't know that, and they didn't know that actually until the end of the war. But the commanders at the time decided, you know what, we have to launch now because otherwise we're going to have the Japanese Navy sink us, and we won't have the element of surprise anymore. So what they did is they launched early. It was several hundred miles early, and so what happened was they were able to complete their mission, drop their bombs, but then they couldn't make it all the way to where they were supposed to get to in China and Russia, so they ran out of fuel. There were a couple that crash landed in Japan, if I remember right, and those guys ended up being prisoners of war for the rest of the war. Couple made it to Russia, a couple made it to China. There were some that crashed in the ocean, but they all succeeded in dropping their bombs. It's just none of them made it where they were supposed to go to, ultimately. See the chair right there on the ground? That chair came out of one of Adolf Hitler's personal transport airplanes. He had several. He had 3 or 4 transport planes that were designated just for him. They're not very big planes. They're nowhere near the size of, say, Air Force One is now. They probably held 30 or 40 people tops. But this came to us via a post-war Jewish charity organization that was auctioning off pieces of Nazi memorabilia in order to support Jewish immigration to Israel. So we ended up with it, and whether or not the man actually sat in that chair, we don't know, but that's the big reason not to sit in it, because you don't want to catch anything from it. You know what I mean? Yeah. All right, come on down this way.
So JT, he could have then.
Could have. We don't know. All right, so what we have on this side is we have a battlefield display. Obviously, it's covered in snow. Does anybody know when the Battle of the Bulge happened in World War II?
43.
44.
December 44 through January 45. It was the last major German counterattack on the Western Front. And their goal was to get all the way to Antwerp, Belgium, in order to seal off the Deepwater port for U.S. and Allied material convoys so they couldn't unload tanks and equipment and food very easily. It would almost push the Allies back to Normandy in order to get heavy material. And what happened was this big giant German military push goes west through the Ardennes forest and pushed fairly significantly into Belgium, except there was one small village called Bastogne where there were several U.S. military units that stayed there and were completely surrounded for about 2 weeks and never gave up. And that was one of the big reasons why the Germans lost the Battle of the Bulge, because they had to devote significant time and resources into this surrounded village. If that village had fallen, possibly the Germans would have made it all the way to Antwerp and prolonged the war in Europe for another 6 months, year maybe. Would have eventually lost anyway, but it would have prolonged the war possibly. We'll come down this way a little bit further. In the corner here we have a small display built in reminiscence of the Battle of Berlin, which was significant house-to-house fighting in April and May of 1945, right at the very end of the war. Soviet troops had entered Berlin about the 3rd week of April. and there was massive house-to-house fighting for a couple of weeks. By the end of the war, most military-aged men in Germany had either been hurt or killed. So the troops that you had were either your grandparents' age or they were younger than you are. So they had Hitler Youth, which were a very militarized version of the Boy Scouts that was young as 10 years old, that were sent out to either fire anti-tank rockets, such as what this display is holding, or anti-aircraft guns in the streets of Berlin at the end of the war. And above you, you see two Soviet anti-tank weapons. These are giant rifles, just like the World War I version we saw outside the museum. These are World War II versions. They weigh about 25 pounds each, which doesn't sound like a lot until you have to carry it all day. And display of some of the rounds that they fired. They're very, very large anti-tank rounds. So come around this way. At the end of the museum here, we have a small display as what it might look like on a South Pacific island occupied by the Japanese. Japanese had some of the technologically best hand weapons and aircraft, but they had very little infrastructure to build and support these, which is one of the reasons why they were invading many areas of the South Pacific, because they were looking for resources. So we built a display which it could be similar to any small Pacific island where you have bamboo huts and no running water and machine guns. What do? You got machine guns, but okay, there's nothing else on this island, right? So come around this way. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
What were these called? These guys?
That is a Type 95 machine gun, I think. They're versions of the British Bren machine gun. They're almost exact copies of it that the Japanese made a few modifications to. But they're styled off the British Bren machine gun, which was developed in the 1920s, I believe.
They've got the clips on top.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they've got... they fire a fairly large round. It's a little bit bigger than a .30 caliber round. Around this corner we have a small World War I trench display showing a British soldier in a World War I trench. Most of the warfare during World War I was fairly stagnant. It was trench warfare where you may be dug into a trench for weeks on end, and every single day there would be waves of soldiers that would go over the trench trying to capture the enemy's trench and create a breakthrough in the lines so that you could move past your enemy's position. And this happened on both sides. It was very violent, brutal, stagnant conflict. In the Battle of the Somme, the British lost, I believe it was 50,000 troops in just one day after repeated onslaughts of human waves of soldiers trying to attack the German positions. It was very brutal fighting, it was very stagnant, not a lot of movement. Whereas World War II, on the other hand, was all mechanized. There was very little fighting in one place for more than a few days at a time. So come on down this way a little bit further. We've got a World War II military police chief that's been fully restored with the markings of the unit that it was originally issued to. The United States made millions of Jeeps. They're made by Jeep, of course. They're made by Ford. I believe General Motors made some as well. And there were a couple other companies that made Jeeps. They all got the same name. They all got called Jeeps just because that's who the first company was making them. But during World War II, there was a very interesting dynamic when it came to production. The U.S. government suspended copyright laws for military equipment. So basically, the U.S. government could say, Jeep, you might have a copyright or a contract to build this item, but you know what? You can't build enough of them. So we're going to let Ford make them, and they're going to make them exactly the same, and you can't sue Ford for making them the way that you make them because we need them. That doesn't happen right now. Right now, what happens is if you want to make something that somebody else has copywritten already, you got to get their permission, or they're going to sue you, and they're probably going to win. That's what Samsung and Apple are going through right now with their phones, right? Anyway, come on down this way. In this corner, we have two machine guns. They're both World War I era machine guns. One's German, one's French. The cosmetic differences you see is the French one does not have the blast shield, whereas the German one does. The French one normally has a blast shield, we just don't happen to have one. The functionality differences are very minimal. They both function the same. They both fired a lot of rounds really fast at the bad guy. They're both stationary. You did not carry these around. There'd be one machine gunner that would stand there and pull the trigger. There'd be a couple of assistant gunners that would help feed ammunition. And then there'd be more assistant machine gunners that all they did is run back and get more ammunition and run forward and bring it to you. Because you couldn't have enough ammunition there. You were firing it faster than people could bring it to you. So that led to a problem. When you fire rounds really fast through a gun, you heat the barrel up. If you heat the barrel up too much, it's metal melts, and then you don't have a functioning firearm anymore. So to combat that, there were two thoughts of how to keep the barrel cool. The French version was to use air cool, and that's why they have these several fins along the barrel. What it would do is it would radiate heat off the barrel into the air. The Germans used a different tactic. They used water, so that it was more like the radiator of your car, whereas cold water would get pumped into the very large cylinder around the barrel. That would heat up due to contact with the barrel, and then it would get pumped out into a reservoir where it would cool, and they would constantly circulate water around the barrel, trying to keep the barrel cool. Machine guns were a brand new invention in World War I. It wasn't something that was highly prevalent before that. It brought on a lot of new tactics, because with the human wave method of coming over the trenches, one machine gunner could then prevent several hundred troops from coming and attacking you. So that meant the bad guys started shooting at you, the machine gunner, all the time. So the Germans started outfitting their machine gunners in those giant suits of plates of armor. But imagine this, they only had about 10,000 of those plates of armor, and they had about 1 million machine guns. So you probably didn't get armor. The opposing troops, the British and the French troops, a lot of times would try to shoot the German machine gunners, and vice versa. The German troops were trying to shoot the British and French machine gunners. Because if you keep the guy from pulling the trigger, then the machine gun can't shoot at you. So there were not a lot of people that wanted to be machine gunners, honestly. Because you're up above the trench, shoot, and you're a big target, people want to shoot at you. Yeah, a lot of people didn't want to do that. Behind me, we have a display for World War II Germans' Africa Corps. Does anybody know why Germany had troops in Africa during World War II?
Was it the oil fields?
No, that was more Italy's issue. Germany was going for Iran and the Caucasus and southern Russia for oil. But who was Germany's ally in World War II in Europe? Italy, exactly.
To regain the Roman Empire.
Part of it, yeah. Prior to the start of World War II, Libya was a colony of Italy. And Mussolini also had a colony in Somalia. And Mussolini said, you know what, we're going to join these two together. So he started a war in Ethiopia, was able to win that war. But then when World War II broke out, Italy decides they're going to invade Egypt, which was a British territory, and we're going to invade Algeria, which was a French territory. So you end up with Italy fighting this war in northern Africa, and they're getting their butts kicked. So they go and ask Germany, hey, can you help us? So Germany sends several divisions of troops, tanks, airplanes, all to northern Africa to bail out Mussolini, and basically spent from 1940 until 1943, when they were kicked back to Italy, fighting a losing war in northern Africa. But what came out of that is they had different colored uniforms because the gray uniforms they used in Northern Europe stood out in the sand, so they had tan colored uniforms. They painted their equipment tan. They painted nice little fancy palm trees on their helmets as decoration. But all the equipment was the same, they just made it out of a different color fabric. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is we have a display in this side over here. This is dedicated to Sergeant Richard Penry, United States Army during the Vietnam War. As I said before, he's the only native-born Petaluman to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. He served with a unit that was overrun and attacked, and he was able to find radios during the battle and evacuate a bunch of wounded during the battle. That saved a lot of men's lives, and was therefore recognized for his heroism. You guys have seen Forrest Gump, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Remember the scene where Bubba died, and Forrest picks all those guys up, pulls like 20 guys out of the bushes, and runs them to safety. That's basically exactly what Sergeant Penry did. Mm-hmm. The only difference was it happened at night. And he didn't get shot in the butt either. So, Hollywood stole the story in my opinion, but we don't know. The uniform and the Medal of Honor is on loan from the family. That's one thing that you're not allowed to have, is a Medal of Honor that wasn't actually issued to you. You get to go to prison for that. So we don't want to do that. Anybody else have any other questions about it? Because I'm about finished.
Just a few. How about a big round of applause for our tour guide, guys? Thank you, guys.